So I welcome everybody on our show, and today we welcome our guest. It's Michail Alexeev. It's a professor of economics from Indiana University in Bloomington. Good day.
Good day. Yeah, Bloomington, Indiana, yes.
Indiana, okay. So if you don't mind, we will talk a little about the perception of the new year 2023 in the economics, what we left, what we supposed to live in this year that's passing, and hopefully we'll talk a little more detail about what's going on between the economic of Russia and Ukraine because of war. So from the very beginning, I would like to start from one of the interesting articles that I found on the Economist site, and it's called "What 2022 Meant for the World." And I would like to quote: "Some years bring disorder, others resolution, but this one asked questions." This is the strike quote. So what questions aroused this year for you and your perception of the future in economics and in geopolitics as a whole?
Well, this is a tough one. The questions, I guess the main question is whether the world economy would be able to function more or less normally when there is a major war going on in the world, and especially when we try to cut ourselves off Russia's natural resources and its economy in general. Now, this is the first time in modern history, as far as I know, that the world economy, or at least the Western world economy, has tried to cut itself off a relatively large economy. Now, the Russian economy is not very large, but it's much larger than, say, North Korea or Iran. And this year, the isolation of the Russian economy and the isolation of the Western economies from Russia, it hasn't been, well, complete. The next year, I expect, will be much more indicative of this. But I think overall, this question could be answered in the affirmative. That is, we can do that, basically. Whether the Russian economy would be able to survive this is a different issue.
Let's look how it affects on the countries. Let's look how the governments of some countries, of the most of the countries in Europe, for example, try to solve the problems with the economical problems inside, domestic problems, and how it affects globally. Because going back to this article in The Economist, I would like to ask you the question. So all around the world, the idea of limited government is taking a beating because of the post-invasion energy shock. European governments are pouring money into fixing prices. This is the one more strike quote. So my question is, how the most governments solve their domestic economical problems, and will it affect positively on their states if it might be harmful for the global ties, economical ties?
Well, it's true that there has been a fairly significant government intervention in the economies because of the war, but this is very much expected. If you look at World War II, say the British economy, it resembled the Soviet economy because it was basically a planned economy during the war. Of course, now the Western economies are affected a lot less than they were in World War II, but still, so I'd say a certain degree of government intervention, it was inescapable. And also keep in mind that it was not actually that great. It was not bigger, say, than the intervention during COVID, when the governments poured a lot of money into the economies. They were not fixing prices, but they poured a lot of money to support businesses and individuals. Now, in terms of the effects, well, the wars are not good for the economies in general. It could be good if we were in the recession prior to that, but we were not. And so the war will have detrimental consequences to the economies of the Western countries. But these consequences, I think, are very much manageable. It is not going to be a huge problem. Some countries in the European Union might enter into the recession, but the European Union will not. At least right now, it is not forecast to have recession in 2023. The United States also is unlikely to be in recession. And even if we are experiencing a recession, it will be a mild one. So I don't see it as a huge problem. It is a problem, clearly, but it's not a very big problem. Of course, the biggest problem in terms of all kinds of aspects, economic and otherwise, it is for Ukraine, but it is also going to be a very significant problem for the Russian economy.
But actually, it will be harmful for the economies of the European countries because they need to spend a lot of money to rebuild in Ukraine, to support Ukraine right now during all this energy crisis.
Yes, but the amounts of money that have been involved and will be involved for the European Union and the United States is relatively modest. In fact, I am very frustrated by very modest response of our government in the United States and the European governments. We should have supported Ukraine much, much more. We could afford this. It is so the U.S., as far as I know, the U.S. has spent this year maybe on the order of 40 or 50 billion dollars on supporting Ukraine. We spent several $trillion on supporting the population and businesses in COVID. Trillions. It was like $5 or $6 trillion. 50 billion for the American economy is what, 1 or 2 tenths of 1% of GDP. It's just not a big deal. And similarly for the European Union, these are rich countries. They could be doing a lot more. Now, I understand the political considerations, and it is an issue because a lot of people don't feel the same way I do, and they do not want to spend money on Ukraine, which is somewhere out there, right? But I would argue it is in the interest of all these societies, countries, to support Ukraine. They just don't necessarily understand this yet.
So you mean that these decisions are grounded not on economical issue, but mostly on political issue? And
it's mostly political.
And that's what the opposite side's using right now in propaganda, because today I was very angry. I saw one man, his name is, I don't actually was trying to dig deeper who is he. He's Jeffrey Sachs. He's like one of your colleagues from one of the University Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. You know him?
Jeffrey Sachs. I met him a couple of times. Yes, he is a well-known economist. Yes.
Maybe he's well-known economist, but he's using these narratives, all the Kremlin narratives, one in one, after 10 years of war, about the poor bill payers of the United States who are very poorly explained why they should spend such a lot of money on supporting Ukraine and blah, 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 and all this stuff that you're saying that's mostly political issue. So, who is interested in this?
He might be right in saying that it's been poorly explained. I would agree with that. But I don't know. I mean, I would need to read exactly what he said. Jeffrey Sachs is basically a competent economist, but he sometimes says things that are a little bit off the wall. So I don't know. My view is that in terms of purely economic effects, the funds that we, meaning the US and the European Union and all that, spend in supporting Ukraine are really trivial. We suffer a lot more from the consequences of the war itself because of the price of energy and food and all that stuff. But I think if we supported Ukraine more, the war would end sooner, and then it would be actually cheaper for all of us. Unfortunately, this is not, he is right, this is not clearly explained to our everyday people, voters, and people who don't follow the news as carefully as I do, and people who are not versed in economics that much. So.
But let's talk about two consequences of the war that mostly affects on the economics globally in different countries. You already named it. First thing, it's the changes in the supply chain that affects very much on the global economy. And the second one is what's going on in the energetic all around the world. So let's a little bit details from the new supply chain, how it looks like right now, and how it affects and how it can harm to the global economy because of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, the supply chain, well, it is mostly the natural resources. The Russian economy has been the major exporter of various natural resources, energy, fertilizer, grain. So these things, they don't as much affect the supply chain. They affect the costs of these resources in the world market and the costs that we pay. In terms of supply chain, there have been some interruptions because Russia supplies some rare metals, but it hasn't been too important. The supply chain breakdown was much, much bigger during COVID because of the interruptions in China and so on. The main thing now has to do with energy, with the cost of energy, and that's where a lot of calls for ceasefire and all that are coming from, because people don't want to pay high prices for energy. The other issue was, for a while, the food prices, but that issue has subsided because of the deal that Russia agreed to let Ukraine export grain, which also allowed Russia to export grain. And actually, if you look at energy prices, this is no longer such a big issue either, because energy prices now are back to the pre-war levels. All right. In fact, if you look at the future contracts, contracts that people enter about the delivery of natural gas, say 1 year from now, those prices are very similar to the prices now and the prices that were before the war. So the markets do not expect a significant increase in energy prices even in 2023.
But on the other hand, we see that a lot of countries are using right now their natural resources such as coal. They're opening the coal minings. And my question is, in this situation, we see that we're turning back from the renewable sources ideas for the future. And for how long it will be this way? And will it change back the habitual rules of games when the monopolists, including Russia, will get back to the market after the war ends? Can it be just going back?
I hope not. I don't think so. I think the world will learn how to live without much of Russia's resources. Now, Russia will export oil, it exports natural gas and coal, it just exports it in smaller quantities to China, India, and so on. And indeed, if Russia stopped exporting oil completely, we would have much higher prices of oil in the world market, because it's a world market. It's not just a market in Western Europe, right? So the main goal here is actually to somehow reduce the revenues that Russia gets from those exports without reducing the quantities of those exports that much. But overall, if we look into the future, this war, if anything, it showed that we should not rely on Russia as an exporter of natural resources, and especially the exporter of energy. So you're right. Right now, Germany, Great Britain, they have reopened some coal mines, and this is very bad for climate and all that. But at the same time, the war with its high prices and the experience, the possibility of this, of using energy as a weapon, this has provided much stronger incentives for the rest of the world to redouble its effort to increase renewable sources of energy. And I'm pretty sure that we will, in fact, get there faster. So I think a year or two ago, there was a hope that that peak oil will be in 5 or 10 years. I think we have just about gone through peak oil. That is the highest demand for oil. And I think we will have less and less need for it, and I hope that in 15 to 20 years, we will use oil not as energy, but maybe as a resource, whatever they make out of it, also plastics or something.
Hopefully. So, but if it wasn't for black swans, any black swans?
Yes, I agree. Yes, black swans could be a problem.
Yeah,
yes.
But before we get deep to the situation with the economics of Russia, I would like to put you one more wide question, because you say, and your colleagues say, that Russia is thrown away from different markets right now because of this isolation. Yes. And understanding that we're living in a pragmatic world, and the countries are trying to use the situation for their own preferences. Benefits. Sure. So let's look for your prognosis for the nearest future, how this economical influence world will be divided, because some of your colleagues say that it will be multipolar world, but others just name concrete countries that will gain their turn to effect through the economics on geopolitics, such as China. Some of them call India because of their extreme demographic growth, but they don't say about poverty that still is very obvious in this country. Some call Asian countries, some call Turkey. Who else? Or maybe you see the clear concept of these new geopolitical influential countries in economics.
It has been multipolar world now for a while, with China being, of course, the other superpower besides the United States, but it might become even more multipolar in the sense that the European Union seems to be getting its act together, and maybe it will become actually more united eventually, politically and economically, and stronger militarily, because this war showed that the European Union is simply not ready for a major war. And if it becomes stronger militarily, it will also be another really big pole in the multipolar world. But yes, you're right. These countries you named, I'm not sure about Turkey. Turkey has significant economic problems, even though it seems to be benefiting from the war, but it has very high inflation and all that. But China, India, they are the beneficiaries of this war, clearly, because they are able to purchase Russian natural resources at much lower prices than the rest of the world does. But I would argue that the United States also is a major beneficiary of this war, so in the sense that it has shown its leadership, it has shown that it can maintain the sort of cohesion within its alliances. It is energy independent, and it has very good weapons. If anybody doubted whether the American weapons were better than the Russian weapons, I don't think anybody does. Mm-hmm. So at this point. So I think that, yes, China, India, but the United States is also a major beneficiary, and eventually maybe the European Union will be too. And I very much hope that in the long run, Ukraine will be a beneficiary too.
That hopefully it will be in the economic field, because from what you say, I understand that future will be the competition of weapons, but not the competition of real achievements in some fields like economics, like science, like intellectual, some experience, whatever.
Well, I hope that we will just need very, very good weapons in order to prevent future wars. But what I meant was that this war showed that the Russian weapons are no match for the Western ones. And so that is a good thing. And that actually makes the United States a beneficiary because everybody sees that it has very, very powerful weapons. No, I hope that this war ends soon and with Ukraine's victory, and then Ukraine will be a beneficiary because of a huge amount of resources that countries are going to pour into Ukraine for reconstruction and rebuilding of its economy.
Okay, let's look behind the curtain. What's going on in the Russian Federation and what role this country will play in the future world? Because from what I see from, for example, CNBC reports, the latest round of Western sanctions against Russia over its invasion of Ukraine are beginning to pinch the country's economy. And Russian Finance Minister Anton Selivanov says the same in his comments to this record. And more of this. Latest news about the ruble that fell by almost 10%. Some experts say that almost 20%. And more of these people in the cities of Russian Federation are suffering because the banks are shutting down their cards and don't even have a chance them to get money from the bank boxes, finding some sneaky ideas how to not letting people get their money from the banks. So what's the real situation with the Russian economy? Not only from the expert of view, but yeah, okay.
Yes, the banks, I don't know, it might be happening in some regions, but say, I talk to people in Moscow, there is no problem with getting money out of your bank account. That is not their major problem. Their major problem is that, yes, the export revenues from oil and natural gas have been declining, and the decline, I mean, they were very high in the beginning of the year, but they started to decline in the second half of the year and really significantly in December because of the embargo on the shipments of oil to Western Europe, seaborne shipments. And this process will continue in 2023. Moreover, when the embargo on the oil products, petroleum products, becomes effective in March of 2023, some forecasts are that Russia will have to reduce its extraction of oil by about 50%, which is a huge amount. There are other forecasts that say it would be more like 20 to 25%. Still, it will be a very big hit to the Russian budget. Now, there is a lot of misunderstanding, I think, in terms of what is going on in the Russian economy. People point to the relative stability of the ruble early on. Now it has returned to about where it was before the invasion. But that is not a real picture of the Russian economy, because the value of the ruble depends mostly on the relationship between export revenues and import costs. But because Russia is cut off to some extent from the imports, the businesses do not need as much hard currency because they can't import anything, so the ruble becomes stronger. That's not the main issue. The main issue is that the Russian economy simply cannot function too well without a lot of those imports and with lower export revenues. When we look at the Russian GDP, yes, it fell only by about 3% this year. First of all, it takes into account the increase in the first 2 months of the year, but much more important, GDP is not an indicator of welfare. It is simply an accounting device. It counts the tanks and ammunition and soldier uniforms that are produced, or the payments made to Russian mobilized people. Clearly, all this does not add to welfare. It is just it is just a waste, basically. They make a tank, so they send it to Ukraine, it's being blown up. It is still part of GDP. The kind of GDP that the Russian people could actually use has declined significantly. I don't know by how much, but I'm pretty sure it's more than 10%. If you look at the real household incomes, well, they also dropped, but maybe not as much as people expected. But the other point I want to make is that all these things depend on how the Russian Statistical Agency calculates inflation. Because if it underestimates inflation, as I suspect it does, then the Russian economy looks better because in the nominal terms are not discounted as much to present a real picture. Because of all these things, my thinking is that the Russian economy is doing worse than the available figures indicate. But more importantly, it is only the beginning. The most important sanctions started only this month, and they will continue in 2023, and this will make the Russian economy worse. Now, I want everybody to understand the Russian economy is not going to collapse. They can sustain the war effort as long as population is willing to acquiesce. But it will be more and more difficult for them to produce weapons, to sustain any kind of reasonable standard of living. But unfortunately, the Russian population has shown that it can tolerate a lower standard of living, it can tolerate this awful unprovoked war. So I cannot predict that that Russia is going to be defeated in 2023. But what I certainly can predict is that things are going to get much worse for Russian economy and the Russian population in 2023.
You are naming the obvious reasons from the analytical, economical point of view, but let's look at the picture from the point of view of ordinary people. So, for the last information that in this budget of Russian Federation, 2/3 of this budget will be represented for military needs, and it means that all of the social needs will be cut off from this budget. As you say, the people don't mind because we are strong, we have to make that everybody will fear us and whatever. But on the other point of view, we still see that 9 packages of sanctions work, but not as fast as we want. Putin still gets somewhere this money to shoot these rockets on our heads each week. So where he gets this money? This is my first part of the question. And the second one, how the life of ordinary people will look in Russia in the 2023? It will be like in 90s or much worse?
Yes, well, he gets his money mainly from the same sources so he used to get it, and namely the exports of energy. Now it's less money, but he is still exporting oil and natural gas to China and oil to India. The main question to me is not even where he gets his money, but why we cannot make the sanctions that prohibit the export of high technology goods to Russia work better, because clearly Russia is able to evade some of the restrictions. They can still get some microchips and other components to make missiles. I agree with you. And as far as I know now in the United States and in Western Europe, we are trying to make the sanctions on the exports to Russia work better. So, and that would be more important, because whatever money Putin gets, if he cannot buy the stuff he needs to support his war machine, that money would not mean much. So that's the first thing. And actually, these things, the barriers to high-tech exports to Russia, they seem to be evaded through Turkey and Kazakhstan. It's not impossible to enforce it better, and I hope that we will. Now, the ordinary Russians, it's clear that the standard of living in Russia declined. And it's clear that it happened at all levels, both the very richest people who actually lost a lot of money, but even the poorer people. And you're right, so Russia is going to spend less on social programs, on education, on healthcare. It reminds me of this old Soviet joke. The price of vodka went up, and the son is asking the father, so will you now drink less? And the father says, no, you will eat less. So that's the way that Putin is going to act. He will not skimp on funding the military, but the social programs are going to suffer. Now, to what extent the Russian population is willing to tolerate this, I think eventually they won't, but for quite a while. The Russians are very, very sort of imperial-minded. So it's almost weird how they view this land acquisition as something good. Why? I mean, even with Crimea, why would anybody want to annex it? It's been a huge hole. It made a big hole in the Russian budget because Russia spent a lot of money there. The Russians could always travel there before. No, now it's ours. It's just a weird mindset as far as I'm concerned. So maybe because of this imperial mindset, they will tolerate it for a year or two, but eventually they won't. I'm pretty sure about that. It's just a question of how long it will take. And they will suffer in 2023 with higher inflation, lower standard of living, but Russia is self-sufficient in food and energy, so they will not starve, they will not freeze. And because of that, they probably will tolerate it for another year or two.
Mm-hmm. But to stop the war, we understand we have to make Russia get rid of this imperialistic vision of the world, because even if we stop the war without this second part, it will start again in a few years. And we understand this. Our neighbors like Poland or Baltic countries understand it.
Yes.
But why it doesn't understand, for example, France and François Macron, for example, trying to make connection with Putin still?
Yes, well, I hope that he is trying to connect with Putin, well, for some good reason. But yes, I agree with you completely. It is very difficult to get rid of this imperial mindset. I just hope, for the sake of the world, that it will happen eventually. But actually, my recent research is exactly on this topic, on the nature of Russian patriotism. And Russian patriotism is actually quite different from patriotism in most countries. Most countries are proud, or citizens of most countries are proud of being citizens of their countries, but they are not aggressive. They are not. So their patriotism and nationalism is not sort of directed outwards. For the Russians, it's actually, they don't think that their country is that good. Actually, if you compare the Russians to citizens of other countries, say Americans think much better of America than Russians do of Russia. But the Russians are still much more willing to support their country, even if it is wrong, than just about any other country in the world. So this is a dangerous phenomenon. I hope that the defeat in the war will change things. Actually, if you look at the Russian history, defeats in wars have been good for Russia. It happened when Russia was defeated in the Crimean War because serfdom was eliminated, and it was good when Russia was defeated in the war with Japan. Mm-hmm. Because they introduced some elements of constitutional monarchy. But when they win wars, or at least don't lose them, things actually sometimes get worse. So
It's some kind of psychological disorder, I think, in this new era. It mostly the questions to the psychological specialists because of this.
Yes.
What's going on from propaganda during all these years and what's happened to their brains. But anyways, my last questions to conclude all that you said will be the next. From what you said, that there are instruments that can help to stop this war much faster than it's prolonged right now we see to the next year. What's the most frightens for the Western world? You see, the exclusion Russian as a huge country that's very quite influenced before from the global economy, the split to different chaotic states of this Russian Federation, or the newborn possibility of different small democratic in the short-term countries on this place of Russian Federation, and continuing to develop the international global economical ties. So what's so frightening for them except for atomic bomb? Let's not talk about this. Let's talk about the prognosis in economic scary moments for the West.
Yes, I don't see anything scary in economic terms, except maybe if things really fall apart in Russia and it becomes like really failed state, then there might be huge waves of refugees, or who knows. And given that there is a lot of weapons now that are going to be in people's hands, that can be a problem. But economically, I don't see significant problems, no matter what the outcome. I mean, for the West, no matter what the outcome is. But my view is that Russia is not going to split up, at least it will mostly remain the same. Maybe some ethnic republics are going to split up, but even that I don't quite see. But what could happen easily, I think, that Russia would become a very large North Korea, meaning that it will be cut off from much of the world and it will be just stewing in its own juices somehow. But again, I don't see it as a big economic problem. The Russian economy is less than 2% of the world economy. As long as Russia is going to export oil and natural gas and some metals and all that, and it is really not going to affect Western economies much at all. I think one thing that the Western governments are scared of is uncertainty. They just don't know what will happen. But deep down, I think the main thing is nuclear war. If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons, I think this war would have ended much sooner, because the West would have provided much more weapons, maybe even its own soldiers, to defeat Russia. But it has a lot of nuclear weapons, and Western governments need to think of that. It is very small probability. It is highly unlikely that Putin is going to use nuclear weapons, but the cost of that is going to be, or would be, so high that we have to think about that. Nonetheless, I think the Western governments could be doing a lot more, particularly in terms of supplying weapons. That would end the war sooner, and it will be better for everybody, actually, including Russia.
Hopefully, politicians will listen first the specialists in different fields, but not their entire ambitions in this situation, to help to stop this atrocity that's going on in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Listen to me.
Yeah, hopefully they will, because we will show it to the world. Thank you for your time. Thank you for this interview. Michail Alexeev, professor of economics, was our guest in this interview today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.